That doesn't mean that nature doesn't speak of God, but it does mean that whatever God is not in the natural world. Okay, now we can extend that. Not bound by time, not bound by space. Well, does that make God a material object? Because when people say, is God real?
A definition of real, believed by many religious people, would be a God that interferes with the material, first of all, that performs miracles, certainly hears prayers, that not only created the material, but planted our physical bodies with an immortal seed of consciousness that's going to outlast our body. Okay, that's interesting. I'm curious where he'll go with this. Like, will he appeal to some sort of Gnostic view of, like, there was this group of early believers who understood that it had to be melded with personal experience and,
profound religious account is bottomless. Mm-hmm. And the biblical representations are like that. There's no limit to the amount of investigation they can bear.
I would say one can have an individual spiritual journey that is bottomless, but it is something that has to be acted out and experienced. I would say, again, that's kind of this dichotomy, the materialistic and the phenomenological.
If you start talking about the inevitability of believing in some basis of a value hierarchy,
not so obvious.
You're talking about something different.
It's not so obvious from the traditional Judeo-Christian perspective that God is properly conceptualized as a being.
That's probably right.
Well,
too.
So it's tricky, right? Because one of the ways that you can approach God traditionally is in relationship to a being, but that's a veil. So why do I say that? Okay, so let's speak about it religiously first, and then we can speak about it conceptually. So there's a tremendous insistence in the Judeo-Christian tradition that God is outside of the categorical structure, right? Like seriously outside. Elijah, the prophet, establishes that God is not in nature. He's not in the earthquake. He's not in the conflagration. He's not in the storm, right? So that doesn't mean that nature doesn't speak of God, but it does mean that whatever God is not in the natural world. Okay, now we can extend that. Not bound by time, not bound by space. Well, does that make God a material object? Because when people say, is God real, which is a variant of the question, is do you believe in God? It's like, well, God's immaterial and outside of time and space. So if your definition of real is material things in the domain of time.
A definition of real, believed by many religious people, would be a God that interferes with the material, first of all, that performs miracles, certainly hears prayers, that not only created the material, but planted our physical bodies with an immortal seed of consciousness that's going to outlast our bodies, and that there's a spiritual plane, perhaps an immaterial plane, but some sort of plane that we will be able to access and interact with. This, what he's saying now does get you to something sort of like a kalam, something caused the universe. There is something beyond matter and space-time. I don't know, again, if that just should lead to the sort of Christianizing of that entire conversation.
In space, then we're not talking about the same thing. Now, usually people approach that question of belief with...
Now, if you're open about the fact that I'm starting out as an academic to interpret the Christian texts to bring more meaning and health and appreciation to society, that's good. And I think that's what he's doing. And I think he is relatively open about that. And a lot of people, as I said, dismiss it or ignore it selectively. But I wish he would acknowledge it when he's confronted by these very intelligent thinkers who are jabbing at specific points. I don't feel like he does that.
Some materialistic framework like that in mind, even if they don't know it.
Yes.
The Christians, let's say, who put this question forward in the hope of getting the answer they want to hear, are materialistic and Enlightenment minds, even though they don't know it, because they have an implicit definition of what constitutes real. Is God...
So he's trying... Okay, that's interesting. I'm curious where he'll go with this. Like, will he appeal to some sort of Gnostic view of, like, there was this group of early believers who understood that it had to be melded with personal experience and, personal connection with the divine, and that it always is going to outstretch whatever the physical material language that we like to use to understand and interact with the world. I just don't think that's entirely true. I think people very dogmatically for the last 2,000 years, well before the Enlightenment, have believed in the sort of God that wants them to, burn witches and to do this and to this, and that curses you and that you have to do this or you're not saved. People believed this stuff.
Real? It's like, no, God's hype.
People had deathly fear of hell. I don't know. I wonder how interpretations of religion will continue to evolve as we continue to become more and more secular. A lot of people struggle to appreciate just how brutal war has always been, just how ready we all are to become slavers in our biology. It's in there, we did this, Nazis. So I feel like we think we're so separate, but we've evolved a long time to get to the last 10,000 years, and in the last 100 years since digital or electricity or whatever, we've evolved very slowly. So
is God real? It's like, no, God's hyper real. That's not the same thing.
I think that the physicality of God is an interesting question.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament tradition, it seems to evolve as far as I can see. If you look at some of the earlier descriptions of God, you've got a God who walks through the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
You've got a God who has a council of angels and the accuser. You have a sort of, it's being at least conceptualized as a much more physical being. And as time goes on, God becomes less localized. And I've heard a lot of theories as to why that's the case. I've just done an episode on my own show.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's true exactly. I don't think there's a clear historical progression like that. There is a constant tension between God as ineffable and then God as manifest in a manner that's comprehensible, right? And so Mircea Eliade mapped.
That's true. I do like that. I do like the description as a tension. I think a lot of things are tension. Check out my Kierkegaard video if you want to hear more on that. Tension between the material and the phenomenological, tension between the individual and the collective, tension between order and chaos, between what we know and what we don't, obviously everything. I do agree with Alex generally. It's interesting because Christ especially was a very intimate, personal figure, and a lot of the recent Christian movements have been all about personal relationship with Christ, and he's a person and he knows you. And there is some uniqueness of Christianity there about it's unique for God to become a person, to act something out very relational, to reach towards us and sacrifice, offer himself for us in a forgiving way. It's not just some standard we have to meet and hope for his forgiveness, hope for absolution. It's something Christ acts out for us, reaches out, calls us to be like him, to clothe ourselves in him. This is a pretty unique God, and it's very personal. And the Holy Spirit, the comforter that's going to inhabit us. This is pretty personal, and that seems to have some element of the physical or the immediate. But he also became much more abstract and overarching, this kind of, all-father beneficent. Now it's like the Kalam, the starter of all things, the embodier of natural law, very different than the pillar of flame in the desert or whatever, very different than, the earlier God. I think it's very well established among academics. I'm curious what Peterson would say to this sort of person who talks about, what is it? Syncretism, dietic? What? Syncretism and how, Yahweh and Baal and El became one, and one was a storm god and a war god and had the consort Ishtar or whatever that was then left aside and then became overarching. And I wonder if he, accepts that a lot of these things come from early paganism, or if he doesn't. He must. People have asked him things like, if all humans ceased to exist, would God still exist? And I forget what he said exactly, it was years ago, but he probably said something like, I'm not sure, or I have no idea, or that's the question, isn't it? So he doesn't believe in this God in the same sense of God was actually walking through the garden. Now, he's saying that Christians are trying to interpret the Bible retroactively in the literalist way we would now, and that's not how it was. That's not how it was meant to be believed. And I just don't think he's correct there. I think humans always have believed. That's what religion has been. It's been the belief in this way of these things. That's why people are so wary of religion. That's why we prefer a metaphorical or philosophical or just wise, open, undogmatic reading.
To some degree. So he was very interested in Nietzsche's proposition that God had died. Mm-hmm. Most people, including Nietzsche, regarded that as like a unique historical event. There was a religious tradition, the Enlightenment arose, in consequence, we became skeptical about God.
I think that's true, generally. That's true.
And in 1850, the philosophers decided that he was no longer necessary or
it is very unique. Yeah, we're living in a fascinating time, guys.
Real. But Eliade, who is a brilliant historian of religion.
We're on the cusp. It seems. I'm not exactly as prescient as, this could be a period of 100 or 1,000 years in which we're on this cusp of uncertainty, and I think we have the potential to just explode out into the universe and explode out into completely different sort of being and way of living, or, destroy ourselves, I guess, would be the other option. But for so long, things have been so similar and moved so slowly, and especially even before agriculture, the state of life on the earth, the state of sentient, conscious experience on the earth was so slow moving in its change. And now agriculture to, whatever, metalworking to boom, 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 accelerating insanely until now we have AI and internet and nuclear and contraception all in the space of a few years, a few decades. It's insane. It's an exciting time.
Has noted that this has happened many, many times, that God has vanished, disappeared. And one of his explanations for that is that a God that's too ineffable, so that's completely outside.
This is interesting. So he's disagreeing.
Of the
Is that true? I just don't know enough about history. There have certainly been groups. You hear atheists say there were always atheists. And it's true to me, it seems. There were certainly always groups. A lot of them were kind of esoteric, acted out rituals, psychedelic sort of things. I don't know if they were necessarily atheist. But there were always groups that interpreted things in different ways. And there was always a tension between the, ineffable personal acting out of things and then this abstract overarching All-Father. And always a tension between institutional and individual faith, and always a tension between. I don't know if there was I don't know if the scientific method and true skepticism. I don't know if that was always dominating or always in tension in the same dialogical way through societies. I think it is a new thing that is very clearly sweeping across in an unprecedented way. I don't think that can be denied.
Completely outside of the categories of time and space, let's say, and who doesn't make himself present as a being, who doesn't have a heavenly council, who has no hierarchy between the pinnacle and Earth itself, tends to float off into space. It becomes so abstract that you can't have a relationship with and then he disappears.
In many ways, this is what Christianity provides with the New Testament and the figure of Jesus. And that's why I think for a lot of Christians, the more important question for you and the question that they're interested in, and you're quite right that a lot of people are like, I want to get you on my team.
Yeah.
I have no dog in this fight. I'm not a Christian.
Yeah.
But I know that a lot of Christians are frustrated when they begin asking about Jesus, who's a much more physical entity. Right? It's a real human being. It's someone of flesh and blood. It's someone who's physically crucified by the Romans.
It's a very different question. It's very different question.
And then is seen as a physical entity, at least according to the canonical tradition, by his disciples after he died.
Yeah.
So when somebody asks you, do you believe that happened? And when I've seen you ask about that question, you tend to still speak in terms of the psychological and the mythological. I think the frustration is that, as you've just said, these are
I
two
don't
different
mind
conversations,
frustrating
right?
Christians in that regard either, because the truth of the matter is, with regard to the gospel accounts, that the mythological and the historical are inextricably cross-contaminated.
Sure.
There's no pulling out the historical Jesus, right? That's a non-starter.
I don't know if that's true. In earlier texts, and this is how myth evolved, and this is how we got kind of the modern religions, that we got the convergence of religion from earlier paganism, fractured paganism. And it's very true that reading, history, reading mythology. What is that? And it's very true that reading myths and such, you have to understand how they thought differently, and piecing things together in the current way we think about history is not easy or possible. But the reason we have our current methodologies, our scientific methodologies, is they are far more reliable. They explain far more. They are these models that are open to change. They don't close us off to total paradigm shifts in terms of understanding how the universe works, understanding how we work. And if you read, especially the early myths, in Peterson's interpretive way, you're going to have to make these leaps that are closing you off to the other interpretations or the other myths, or just pure and simple, this is made up, being able to acknowledge that. And then Jesus is a slightly different thing. I mean, it's a more modern thing, and we have, idea about who wrote it and when they exist in relation to him and how much they knew, primary sources, secondary sources. I think it's a little bit strange to say he can't be tangled out from the mythological compared to, Adam and Eve or whatever.
Just that's a non-starter. And why that is, I don't know. It's very mysterious. It's very hard to understand. As is.
Wait. He's been saying this more lately. It's a non-starter, or we don't even know what that means. He's been saying those things, I think, a bit more often recently. And I feel like that's kind of a cop-out when you just say we don't even know what that is. The mythological and the literal are inextricable, and the historical are inextricable, and we don't know why that is. I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know if that's true. I think there are entire cadres of academic-minded humans dedicated to untangling these precise things.
Are let's say, the accounts of the resurrection. Okay, so what do I think about that? Well, I think that denying the historical reality of Christ I think that's just a fool's errand.
Of course.
I don't know why anybody would bother with it.
So a man exists called Jesus. We have
Yes.
that much.
Now, there's a claim that is attributed to Christ that he is the embodiment or the incarnation, the fulfillment, let's say, of the prophet and the laws.
Yes.
I think that's true.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What does that mean? Well, I think it's in the Gospel of John. I think Gospel of John closes.
If you start by saying you think something's true, but you have to work out what it means, then it feels like you're starting from a place of, I'm going to interpret this however is best or however most meaningful. And then, okay, well, what does that mean? What is best? What does meaningful mean? Oh, I don't know. I'm going to try to work that out. It feels like you're still just starting from the place of the science or the skeptic. It doesn't feel like the sort of thing he conveys it is when he says, Dawkins is 95% Christian or things like that.
With a statement that something like, if all the books that were ever
Yes.
written were written about the gospel accounts, that wouldn't be enough books to explain what had happened.
Yeah, if
Yes.
all the things that Jesus did.
Yeah. And there's a truth in that. The truth is that profound religious account is bottomless.
Mm-hmm.
And the biblical representations are like that. There's no limit to the amount of investigation they can bear, not least because the text.
I would say one can have an individual spiritual journey that is bottomless, but it is something that has to be acted out and experienced. I would say, again, that's kind of this dichotomy, the materialistic and the phenomenological. I would say we could know everything about how the Bible was compiled, everything about the brain state of every single person who contributed to writing it, everything about how it does or does not relate to any true, actually existing entity of God. We could have a complete understanding of all of history up until this point. You could be omniscient up until this point. You could have been God. And then if you're snapped into this body and you still have to move forward, experience is bottomless, and the religious exploration of your experience would potentially be bottomless. But again, he's just defining that as religion. It's like the stepping out into experience in tension with this, in communion with other humans that you have to get along with, and blah blah blah. And you have to have faith that it's worthwhile, because then you'll slip into nihilism. He's defining the religious in this way. But I don't think just literally how these texts were compiled and everything that went into them is bottomless. I don't think he's argued that, and I don't think you can just kind of assert that.
Text itself is deeply cross-referenced, so there's like...
Yes, but anything compiled in this way is going to be, and we could add all the authors from then Dante. He talks about, Dante and Milton, whatever, him, people 1,000 years from now, you could add all of them, and then it would even be more cross-references. That's something we bring to this, because we are these pattern-seeking beings that have to live out this life, that take these ideas, act them out, test and tweak them as we go. It's not divine. It's not divine. It's not a divinely sparked thing.
There's an innumerable number of paths through it. It's like a chess
Unless you change the meaning of divine.
board. And so it's inexhaustible in its interpretive space.
That's true.
And that's a problem too, because it means it's also susceptible to multiple interpretations, including potentially competing interpretations.
I think a lot of people interpret Paul, for example, the earliest New Testament source, as saying that if Jesus did not literally rise from the dead, if there was not a man who stopped breathing and then started breathing again, then your faith is futile and you're still in your sins. That is, Christianity is undermined. Now, that means that, and Paul doesn't say sort of believing that that's false is really bad. He says, if you do not believe this proactively, then your faith is futile.
That's the problem I have with that.
If you don't proactively believe that yourself, then I think when a Christian asks you, do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Are you a Christian? I think you must be committed to saying no, at least under that interpretation of Paul. And even if you're not sure, I mean, it's fine if I say to you, do you think that a man physically rose from the dead? And you say something like, well, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there, but I think it has a lot of mythological significance, or I think that maybe it happened in a different sense, or it happened in the sense that good fiction happens, then fine. But it needs to begin with that caveat of the simple sort of, historically speaking, I don't know. And I know you don't like to pull out the historical Jesus from the mythological.
That's a good objection.
But it's an important question to ask.
No, of course. It's a very good objection. So I just did
It's good when he says these things. Fair enough, or that's a good objection. I wish he'd just pause a moment and acknowledge and say, I know what you guys are talking about. Like, he knows. I know what you guys are talking about. And you're right. Now, what am I offering, or what am I saying we need to cling to that loses? And I don't know. I mean, maybe that's what he's trying to do. Maybe that's his entire endeavor. But it's in these sort of conversations where hops back and forth that I feel like people get frustrated for valid reason.